What if history's most wanted criminal never faced justice? For 80 years, we've been told Adolf Hitler died in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. The war ended. The villain was gone. Case closed. Except the Soviets never showed the body. Stalin himself publicly claimed Hitler escaped. The FBI kept active files on Hitler sightings in Argentina through the entire 1950s. And when scientists finally got their hands on the skull fragment Russia had been displaying as proof, it belonged to a woman. This isn't conspiracy theory territory. This is a genuine forensic nightmare that's frustrated investigators for nearly 8 decades. What we're about to uncover involves secret Nazi escape networks that definitely existed, declassified intelligence files that raise serious questions, and modern DNA testing that may have finally solved the mystery. But the answer changes everything we think we know about World War II's ending. Let's start with what you probably learned in school. April 1945. Berlin is falling. Soviet forces are closing in from all sides, and deep underground in a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler knows it's over. The walls shake with every explosion. Time is running out. On April 26th, his generals deliver the final blow. The war is essentially lost. According to witnesses, Hitler has a complete meltdown. He rages, blames everyone, and collapses into despair. By April 29th, Hitler is contemplating how this will end. If he dies, he needs it to mean something. He needs to become a martyr. So that night, just after midnight, he marries his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. No celebration, just witnesses and the sound of artillery getting closer. The next morning, April 30th, Hitler retreats into his private quarters with Eva. Moments later, a gunshot. When aides enter, they find both bodies. Eva took cyanide, Hitler shot himself. His inner circle carries out his final orders. Take the bodies outside, douse them with gasoline, burn everything. Hitler had seen what happened to Mussolini 2 days earlier, captured and hung upside down in a public square. He was determined that wouldn't happen to him. In the middle of a burning city, they perform a hasty cremation in a shallow crater. Hours later, Soviet troops arrive and find charred remains. The Third Reich has fallen. Hitler is dead. Simple story, right? Here's where it gets complicated. The Soviet soldiers who first reached the bunker weren't treating it like a crime scene. They were treating it like a souvenir shop. People grabbed anything they could carry: Nazi flags, documents, personal items. The investigation was chaos. No careful forensic work. No photographs of the bodies. Just soldiers disturbing evidence everywhere. Fire experts later pointed out another problem. The amount of fuel used couldn't fully cremate 2 human bodies. Professional cremation requires sustained temperatures above 1,400 degrees for hours in a controlled environment. What Hitler's aides had was a few cans of petrol and an open-air fire. The bodies should have been much more intact. Some witnesses mentioned the body looked different. Not dramatically different, just off. The Soviets initially claimed they had recovered Hitler's remains, but they never showed them to Western allies, never allowed independent verification. And then Stalin himself started making strange comments. Despite his forces allegedly having the body, Stalin told Western leaders he believed Hitler had escaped. Most historians think Stalin was playing political chess. By keeping the Hitler question ambiguous, he could justify keeping Soviet troops in disputed territories. But it worked too well. By mid-1945, nearly half of Americans believed Hitler didn't die in Berlin. Here's the really wild part. Hitler's death certificate wasn't issued until 1956, 11 years after his supposed death. They declared him dead without a body present. So if the official story has this many holes, what else could have happened? Here's something that isn't a conspiracy theory. thousands of high-ranking Nazis successfully escaped Europe after the war. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, lived comfortably in Argentina for over a decade. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who performed horrific experiments, died of natural causes in Brazil in 1979. Walter Rauff, the SS colonel who designed mobile gas chambers, lived openly in Chile until 1984. Klaus Barbie worked for US intelligence before settling in Bolivia. These men used organized networks specifically designed to smuggle Nazis out of Europe. These networks were called rat lines, and they were terrifyingly efficient. The routes typically ran through Austria and Italy, often with help from sympathetic Catholic clergy and former SS contacts. A fugitive would arrive at a monastery with nothing. Within days, he'd have a fake passport, forged Red Cross papers, a new identity, and a ticket to South America. One organization, ODESSA, allegedly specialized in moving former SS officers to safety. Historians debate how centralized it was, but the results speak for themselves. Hundreds of Nazis vanished from Europe and resurfaced in South America with new names and stashed money. So when people ask whether Hitler could have escaped, the infrastructure definitely existed. The question is whether he used it. The most popular theory points to Argentina. Germany had established communities there dating back to the 1800s. By World War II, entire neighborhoods in Buenos Aires spoke primarily German. A refugee could blend in easily. After the war, Argentine President Juan Perón actively welcomed former Nazis. He saw them as skilled professionals. His government issued thousands of entrance permits to Germans with suspicious backgrounds. For a fleeing Nazi with connections, Argentina was practically a sanctuary. In 2011, British authors Gerard Williams and Simon Dunstan published a book called Grey Wolf that sent shockwaves through the historical community. They claimed Hitler escaped by submarine, following rat lines through Spain, and settled in Patagonia. They suggested he lived there until 1962, dying at age 73. They even claimed he and Eva Braun had 2 daughters, but witnesses came forward. An elderly man who had been a teenager in the 1940s claimed he worked at a monastery in Spain, where Hitler and Eva Braun stayed in 1945. He described specific details: Hitler's trimmed mustache, Eva's blonde hair, armed guards. He told the story with absolute conviction. Then there are the declassified intelligence files. FBI and CIA documents from the 1950s contain multiple reports of Hitler sightings in South America. One CIA file from 1955 includes a photograph of a man allegedly living in Colombia who bears a striking resemblance to Hitler. The agency received the tip from a former SS officer but never investigated due to limited resources. Were these credible sightings or mistaken identity? We don't know. They were never properly followed up. Some theories go wilder. There's the Antarctica hypothesis. Nazi Germany did send expeditions there in the 1930s, claiming territory they called Neuschwabenland. In 1946, the US Navy launched Operation High Jump, deploying over 4,000 troops to Antarctica with battleships and aircraft. The official explanation was scientific exploration. But why send such a massive military force for science? Now here's the counter-argument, and it's strong. Hitler was a megalomaniac who craved attention and control. His entire identity was built around being the leader of Germany. The idea that he would abandon that and live quietly under an assumed name contradicts everything we know about his personality. He wanted to be remembered as a historic figure, even if that meant dying dramatically. There's also the timing. 2 days before Hitler's alleged death, Mussolini was captured and hung upside down in a public square. Hitler was reportedly deeply disturbed. He told his staff he would never allow himself to be captured. This fits perfectly with the bunker death narrative. Hitler wanted control over his death to control his image in history. Running away to live anonymously doesn't fit that psychological profile. So which story do we believe? That's where the physical evidence comes in. And this is where things get really interesting. For decades, the Soviet Union claimed they had Hitler's remains locked away in Moscow. Parts of a skull, fragments of jaw, some teeth. They never showed these publicly, never allowed independent examination. They insisted the evidence was conclusive. In 2000, Russia put the skull fragment on public display for the first time. A small piece of bone with a bullet hole. They claimed it proved Hitler died from a gunshot wound, exactly as witnesses described. The fragment was kept in the Russian state archives, carefully preserved in a controlled environment. For years, historians and scientists had requested access. Most were denied. Then, in 2009, everything changed. An American archaeologist named Nick Bellantoni was granted rare permission to examine the skull fragment. He was a bone specialist from Connecticut with decades of experience in forensic anthropology. The Russians allowed him to take samples for DNA testing, confident that science would finally silence the skeptics and vindicate their decades-long claims. The results shocked everyone. The skull didn't belong to Hitler. It didn't even belong to a man. DNA analysis showed it came from a woman, probably under 40 years old. Think about what this means. For over 60 years, the primary piece of physical evidence was actually someone else's skull. Was it Eva Braun's? Was it from another woman who died in the bunker? Was it a random victim caught in the crossfire? Nobody knows. The discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community and reignited debates that many thought had been settled. The Russian government went into immediate damage control. They insisted their other evidence was still valid, particularly the jawbone with teeth. They pointed out the American team hadn't tested the jaw. The jaw had been matched to Hitler's dental records back in 1945, using testimony from his actual dentists who were captured and interrogated by Soviet forces. The story of how the Soviets found the remains is itself suspicious. According to their account, a Russian private named Ivan Churakov discovered Hitler's body on May 5, 1945, 5 days after the reported death. But several different Soviet units claimed credit for the discovery. The details changed over time. First, the bodies were in the garden, then buried in a crater. Later accounts mentioned they'd been moved multiple times before final burial. Adding to the confusion, the Soviets allegedly burned what remained of the bodies in 1970 and scattered the ashes in a river. They claimed they did this to prevent the burial site from becoming a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. But it also conveniently eliminated any chance of future verification. The only things kept were the jaw fragments and the now discredited skull piece. What makes the dental evidence complicated is that dentistry in the 1940s was already quite advanced. Hitler's dentist, Dr. Hugo Blaschke, and his dental technician, Fritz Echtmann, were both captured by Allied forces. They were questioned separately, and both described Hitler's dental work in detail. They mentioned specific bridges, particular patterns of decay, and unusual structures that would be hard to fake. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent, which lent credibility to the Soviet claims about the jaw. Then came 2017. A French forensic team, led by Professor Philippe Charlier, was allowed to examine the jawbone that Russia had kept separate from the discredited skull. They were given limited access, but managed to conduct thorough examinations. They published their findings in the European Journal of Internal Medicine. The teeth matched historical dental records. They showed evidence consistent with a vegetarian diet, which aligned with Hitler's documented eating habits. Hitler had been a strict vegetarian since the 1930s, and the lack of certain wear patterns supported this. The teeth had poor quality bridges, matching descriptions from Hitler's medical files. The wear patterns, bone structure, and specific dental issues all lined up. The French team concluded the jaw likely belonged to Hitler and that he probably died around the time claimed in April 1945. But here's the problem. All this evidence is controlled by Russia. The chain of custody has massive gaps spanning decades. The Cold War created a period where no Western scientist could verify anything. Even now, access is severely limited and tightly controlled. Requests for further testing are often denied or delayed for years. Modern technology could solve this definitively. DNA sequencing could compare the remains to Hitler's living relatives. Several of Hitler's relatives had descendants who are still alive today. Genetic genealogy, the same science that solved decades-old cold cases and identified unknown soldiers, could provide absolute confirmation within weeks. Facial reconstruction technology could rebuild what the person looked like from skull fragments. Isotope analysis could determine where someone lived based on minerals absorbed into their teeth and bones from local food and water sources. We have the tools. We have the technology. We just don't have full cooperation or access to the evidence. And without that, the shadow of uncertainty remains. Some researchers point to the body double theory. It's documented that other dictators use doubles. Stalin had several men who resembled him for security reasons at public events. Saddam Hussein reportedly had at least 3 body doubles surgically altered to look like him. Could Hitler have prepared a look-alike for his final deception? Witnesses did mention small inconsistencies. One guard said the body's feet looked larger than he remembered. Another commented that facial features seemed slightly off, though he attributed it to death and stress. Eva's clothing didn't quite match what some remembered her wearing earlier that day. But these accounts came from traumatized people in chaos. The bunker was dim, lit only by flickering emergency lights. People were in shock, facing the collapse of everything they'd known. Soviet shells were exploding overhead, shaking dust from the ceiling. Memory under those conditions is notoriously unreliable. Studies have shown that eyewitness testimony during extreme stress is often distorted or inaccurate. The dental evidence is the strongest card in the official story's hand. Teeth are incredibly specific. The combination of natural tooth structure, decay patterns, and artificial dental work creates an almost unique signature. That's hard to fake with 1940s technology when dental records weren't digitized and dental work was done entirely by hand. Without independent DNA verification from multiple labs, without a complete chain of custody that can be verified, and without access to living relatives for genetic comparison, there's still a shadow of doubt. Not a large shadow, but enough to keep the debate alive in certain circles and online forums. So, what do historians actually believe? The vast majority accept that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. The dental evidence is compelling. The witness testimonies, despite minor inconsistencies, tell a coherent story. The psychological profile fits. Hitler wanted to control his death and avoid capture. The escape theories, while intriguing and built on some factual elements, lack concrete proof needed to overturn the established narrative. But the fact that we're still discussing this 80 years later tells us something important about human psychology, justice, and how we process historical evil. We struggle with the idea that someone responsible for the deaths of millions got to choose how and when he died. There was no trial, no public reckoning, no moment where he had to face his victims or answer for his crimes, no courtroom where evidence was presented and guilt was established. He simply disappeared into a room with Eva Braun, and that was it. Compare that to the Nuremberg trials, where other Nazi leaders were prosecuted in open court. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and others sat in a courtroom while prosecutors detailed their crimes. Survivors testified. Documents were presented. The world watched as these men were held accountable. That process gave survivors and victims a measure of closure. With Hitler, we got a story from witnesses who had every reason to lie, physical evidence controlled by a government that wouldn't share it, and decades of secrecy that bred suspicion. The Soviet secrecy made everything worse. By refusing to share evidence and changing their story multiple times, they created space for doubt to flourish. When the most powerful government in Eastern Europe claims Hitler is dead but won't show proof, and their leader suggests he escaped, trust evaporates. This matters beyond academic curiosity. It shapes how we think about accountability for authoritarian leaders today. When powerful people commit atrocities, we need clear endings. We need justice to be visible, not assumed. We need evidence that can be verified by independent parties, not locked in state archives. Look at how Adolf Eichmann was handled. He was captured, put on trial in Jerusalem, and executed in 1962. The trial was televised. Evidence was presented publicly. Survivors testified in court. There was no mystery, no conspiracy theories, no way to deny what happened. That's the standard we should expect. The Hitler escape theories persist because they tap into a fundamental fear that someone that evil could simply vanish, that justice could be avoided through planning and resources, that the most wanted criminal in history might have lived in comfort while his victims never got answers. It's a fear that resonates today whenever powerful people seem to escape accountability. There's also the family dimension. Hitler's nephew, William Patrick Hitler, was born in England. He moved to the United States, joined the US Navy, and fought against the Nazi regime. After the war, he changed his name and lived quietly. Other relatives reportedly made pacts never to have children, hoping to end the bloodline. They carried the weight of that name in ways most of us can't imagine. Today, we have the technology to resolve this mystery completely. Genetic genealogy could definitively confirm whether those remains in Russia belong to Hitler. Facial recognition I could analyze photographs with unprecedented accuracy. Advanced forensic techniques could extract information from the smallest bone fragments, but that requires cooperation, transparency, and access. As long as key materials remain locked away, the debate continues. Here's what we know for certain. The evidence overwhelmingly supports that Hitler died in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. The dental records match. The witness accounts align. The psychological profile makes sense. But the reason this mystery endures isn't about the evidence. It's about what that ending represents. Hitler spent 12 years terrorizing Europe and orchestrating the systematic murder of millions. He built an empire on hatred, started a war that killed over 70 million people, and created industrialized genocide on a scale never seen before. And then, when it all came crashing down, he got to choose his exit. No capture, no trial, no public accountability. That doesn't sit right with us, and maybe it shouldn't. The victims of the Holocaust never got closure. The families destroyed by war never got to see justice served. The people who suffered never got to see Hitler face consequences. They got a story about a bunker, a hasty cremation, and contested remains. They got decades of Soviet secrecy. They got enough ambiguity to fuel conspiracy theories for generations. The escape theories persist because they express a deeper truth about how we process evil. We want definitive endings. We want to see justice served visibly. We want proof that monsters don't get to write their own final chapters. When we don't get that, when history gives us ambiguity instead of closure, something in us rebels against accepting it. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about whether Hitler escaped. It's about why we need clear, verifiable, transparent evidence when history's darkest chapters close. It's about why documentation matters more than political convenience. It's about why we prosecute war criminals publicly, preserve evidence carefully, and share findings openly. Because when we don't, when we allow secrecy and ambiguity to cloud the historical record, we create fertile ground for doubt. And that doubt can be exploited, manipulated, and twisted into something dangerous. It can be used to deny atrocities, to rehabilitate monsters, to rewrite history. 80 years later, we're still talking about how Hitler died because we never got the closure that justice demands. We got a story that makes sense. We got evidence that mostly supports it. We got decades of secrecy that undermined confidence. And we got just enough gaps to keep the questions alive. Hitler's story ended in that bunker beneath a ruined city, surrounded by the consequences of his own choices. The empire he built lasted 12 years. The war he started killed millions, and in the end, he died knowing he'd failed completely. But the fact that we still question it, still search for definitive proof, still demand better answers, shows something important about humanity. We refuse to let evil disappear quietly into history. We demand evidence. We demand truth. We demand justice that can be verified. And maybe that persistence, that refusal to accept convenient stories without proof, that insistence on transparency and accountability is the real ending this story deserves. Not the ending Hitler wanted, where he controlled the narrative even in death, but the ending we need, one that reminds us that historical truth matters, that justice must be visible, and that the world deserves better than shadows and secrets when confronting its darkest moments.